Well, good evening. I'm turning in my Bible to the book of Exodus, and I invite you to do the same. The passage it was read for us just a few moments ago, Exodus chapter 19. And while you turn to that, let me thank you so very much for your presence here tonight, and hope that you will get the opportunity to meet my wife. She's over here. I did not sit with her. It's not because she's still in quarantine. I just thought she was sitting with Nate. And didn't you guys sit on that row last night? Okay, so I was thinking, there's not going to be room for me. Oh, one more up. Okay, all right. So anyway, I came up here and sat, and then I look over here, and she's all lonely over there by herself. So anyway, I hope that you'll get a chance to meet her. It'll be a lonely drive for me on the way home tonight. And so, but I'm so glad to have her with me. Things just go a whole lot better when she's along with me, and grateful for her and the help that she is to me. And by the way, let me scratch this. Let's go from Exodus to Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 43. Isaiah chapter 43. That's actually where I wanted to start tonight. Isaiah chapter 43. I hope you've had a good Thursday. Look forward to our study tonight. And that as we leave here, that we will be benefited as a result of our time in God's Word this evening. Isaiah chapter 43. And I want us to begin our reading here in verse 10. Isaiah 43 and verse 10. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am He. Before me there was no God formed, and there will be none after me. Even I am the Lord, and there is no Savior beside me. It is I who have declared and saved and proclaimed, and there was no strange God among you. So you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and I am God. There was a Jewish rabbi who was walking on a dusty trail north of the Sea of Galilee, and he was reciting this passage from the prophecy of Isaiah. He was attempting to commit this text to his mind and his heart, but he was also trying to understand this twofold reference here to Israel being God's witnesses. And as he concentrated intently on the passage, the sun went down below the horizon, and he now found himself on the trail in the dark. He came to a familiar fork, and typically he would have turned to the left, and that trail would have taken him home. But for some reason that night, he decided to go to the right. And as he traveled in the dark on that trail, after several minutes, he arrived at a small Roman fort that was home to a garrison of soldiers. And out of the darkness, there came a loud voice from up on the wall. Who are you? What are you doing here? Well, the rabbi was a bit taken by surprise by the voice, and so he simply responded, "What?" So the soldier repeated the same two questions, this time more loudly. Who are you? What are you doing here? The rabbi paused for a moment, and he responded with a voice that was more confident than the first time, and he now replied with a question of his own. What do you get paid to ask me these questions? Now, it was the Roman soldier who was a bit taken back. And so he paused for a few moments, and with sarcasm in his voice, he answered, 3 denarii a week, Jew. Why? And the rabbi replied, I will pay you double that if you will stand outside my house and ask me those same 2 questions every day that I leave home. Who are you? What are you doing here? Do we know who we are? And I'm not talking about, what we've accomplished in life, or, for you to define your family tree or what job you hold, but who are you? Who am I really? Deep down. And what are you doing here? Not here, necessarily, but why are you here at all? What's your purpose, your mission, your reason? Because when it comes to answering these two important questions, there's really only a couple of possibilities from which to select. One possibility is to do what most folks in our world do, and that is that they speculate and conjecture and they theorize and they guess, but in all of that, they never look beyond their own humanity. The second possibility comes not from man, but from divine revelation, that when it comes to our identity and our purpose, God has not left us in the dark. We are not dependent upon our own speculation. What God tells us is that each and every one of us is a part of a story, and not our own personal story. All of us, especially those of us with any age, I think could sit down with a tablet and a piece of paper, and we could sort of map out the different chapters that our life has held. But God says we're part of something that's much bigger than that. That we have a role in a much more encompassing story than just my own personal story. And older people, one of the struggles that we have is that as we get older, our kids are gone. Sometimes we retire, and we lose our sense of purpose and meaning. What is my mission? Is my mission over? I've raised my family, my kids are grown and gone, I spend some time with the grandkids, but I don't go to work every morning. But we continue to have a purpose and a mission in God's part of the story. Our nation, our culture, seems to be increasingly drifting toward atheism. And when you do that, what happens is that you become robbed of both identity and purpose. We become just a bunch of random molecules who have no reason whatsoever for our existence. As one fellow put it so eloquently, we go from goo to you by way of the zoo, is how he phrased it. Back in 2009, January of 2009, atheist Richard Dawkins, he penned the book, The God Delusion. He teamed up with the British Humanist Society, and they raised a fairly significant amount of money. And with that money, they purchased advertising that was to go on the signs, the sides of buses in the United Kingdom. And here's what the sign said. There is probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Some observations about this. First of all, there's a key word up here, right? And it's the word probably. That's sort of a significant word. It's an admission that they don't know for sure, and they know they don't know for sure. That in their minds, they've done the calculations after guessing and theorizing and conjecturing, and they believe that the odds of God existing are somewhere less than 50%, right? But what if they're wrong? A second observation is that the statement at the end assumes that those of us who believe in God are the miserable folks on the planet. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity is all sunshine and lollipops, right? I mean, there's challenges and there's difficulties that come with the life of a Christian. But I'm enjoying life. And I think most of you are as well. In fact, studies have been done that show that people of faith are actually less stressed, more content, happier than the general population. A third observation is, if this is indeed true and there is no God, then you are left with the fact that human existence emerged merely by chance. And if that is indeed the case, there's no way to avoid the inevitable conclusion that when it comes to purpose and meaning, those become words used only by fools when you're talking about human existence. Instead, the Bible declares that often and in a variety of ways that we are not the result of an accident, that chance is not our creator, that fate is not our father. Instead, we exist because of the skill and the will of the most accomplished craftsman in the universe. And that he did more than just make us, but he made us to be the objects of his love with specific purposes in mind. And friends, that makes each and every one of us, whether you're 18 or whether you're 80, significant, valuable. We understand, when we understand and acknowledge that God is our maker, that we have a purpose, that he has a purpose for our lives, that we are not made for time, but rather for eternity. Our significance is altered, our values are changed, our priorities get all reordered, don't they? That regardless of where we are, at what stage or what season in life, every single one of us has meaning and value and purpose. That our ability to answer these two important questions, who are you? What are you doing here? Is totally dependent upon us knowing and understanding the story that we are a part of. And ancient Israel provides us with a marvelous parallel. I'm going to back up. You'll see that next slide as we go through. I should have put a black slide in here. Israel is going to help us to understand that. When we come to see who they were, when we understand what they were doing here, when we understand their story, it's going to help to equip us to understand who we are, what we're doing here, and to grasp our part in that story as well. So now let's make our way over to the book of Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19, that was read just a few moments ago. In the third month, this is beginning in chapter 19, verse 1. In the third month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." Now, as we begin tonight, let's just understand Israel's part in God's story. If we were to back up, most of us would be familiar with the fact that back in Genesis chapter 1, that God creates Adam and Eve, and he creates man and woman for fellowship with him. And yet at some point in the story, sin enters the picture. And it fractures humanity's relationship with God. And that once you move out of Genesis chapter 3, every human being follows in the same footsteps as the original pair. By the time we arrive at Genesis chapter 6, humanity has become so corrupt that God deems it necessary to wipe the entire planet clean and to start over again with the family of Noah. And as we continue reading in the book of Genesis, we get over into chapter 10 and chapter 11, and we find that from the descendants of Noah there comes a man of faith by the name of Abram. He'll later be his name changed to Abraham. And in Genesis 12 and verses 1 through 3, God not only gives to Abraham instruction, I want you to leave here, your home, and I want you to go to the place where I'm going to tell you to go, but he also provides to him a promise to him and to his lineage. And that is that it will be through Abram's seed that blessing to all of the nations will be realized. As we continue reading in the book of Genesis, we of course read of Abram, his child of promise in the form of Isaac, Isaac's twins, Jacob and Esau, and the fact that Jacob is the one who's chosen out of those twins. And as we conclude the book of Genesis, we are focused on Jacob's 12 sons, and in particular, a remarkable man of conviction and faith by the name of Joseph. Jacob's family has gone from Canaan. They are now at the end of Genesis. They are in the land of Egypt. And then there is a white place between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And in that white place, there are some 400 centuries of time that pass. And during that passing of time, the descendants of Abram have not only developed into a nation, but they are now an enslaved nation. Through a series of plagues and under the leadership of Moses, God delivers Israel from that bondage. And what we find here in this text is that in the third month, they now arrive at Sinai, having been delivered from Egypt, and they will remain here at Mount Sinai for almost a year. Now, in between, the Passover, their departure from Egypt in chapter 12 or 13 and chapter 19, we're told some things about the nation of Israel, and most of it is in the form of grumbling and complaining. They're not happy with the food, they're not happy with the water, they're not happy with the terrain. And in essence, behind all of the grumbling, they're asking the question, what are we doing here? Because their deliverance from Egypt is not turned out like they thought that it should. It's been a lot more difficult, a lot more challenging than they expected. But as they come to Mount Sinai, they also have no idea who they really are. Because remember, to this point in time, they had been an enslaved minority. They had been used and abused by a more powerful nation, and they have now left Egypt, and they have done so as the people of God. They are going to be God's chosen vessel that is going to play a vital role in bringing blessing, not simply to themselves, but to all of the nations of the earth. And by the way, here in Exodus chapter 19, this is Israel's first official encounter with God. And he does three things. First of all, he points them to the past. He wants them to look back, and he wants them to think. He also points them to the future. He tells them, okay, this is where all of this is going. And then he tells them from the past, and where I want this to go, here's what I want you to be at this present moment in time. That's pretty much the lesson in a nutshell tonight. Let's develop that. So let's start with the past. You'll notice in verses 3 and 4, Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Now, first of all, understand that what the message that Moses is getting is not for Moses himself. It's for all of Israel. You see that in verse 3. You see that in verse 6. That Moses is not up on Mount Sinai for his own personal communion with God. He is up there for the purpose of receiving God's message and bringing it down to the people. And it's not, the word itself is not contained here, but the message of verses 3 and 4 is fairly simple, and that is, remember. Remember. He begins by pointing to himself and the actions that he has done and performed on their behalf. He, in essence, summarizes Exodus chapter 6 through chapter 19 in a couple of sentences. As God discloses himself to the people of Israel, he wants them to think back to what God has done for them in destroying Egypt. What he has done to Egypt and what he has done for them in order to bring them to himself. Now, again, keep in mind, there's a time context that's given to us here in verse 1 that has been less than 3 months since they have left Egypt. That less than 3 months ago, these same people were being beaten and whipped. That 3 months earlier, these were slaves who were not only being exploited, but the early chapters of Exodus tell us that they were also experiencing state-sponsored infanticide. That less than 3 months earlier than this, these same people were being savagely treated, and it was in their great misery that they had cried out to their God in Exodus chapter 2 and verses 23 through 25. That less than 3 months earlier, these folks witnessed what God did to the Egyptians in response to their pleas. They experienced his deliverance firsthand. They were there when God devastated the powerful nation of Egypt, and as he describes it here, bore them as though they were on the wings of eagles. And he brings them out to Sinai as a liberated, redeemed group of people. He has welcomed them into his presence. He is offering them a covenant of promise that comes not by their own efforts or their own merits, but simply because of what God did on their behalf. Now, we've read ahead, and if you're familiar with the book of Exodus, you know where this is heading, and what's coming next in chapter 20 is the giving of the law, and in particular, the Ten Commandments. But understand that the Ten Commandments, that whatever is coming after chapter 19 is going to be based on what God has already done for them in the earlier chapters. And therefore, their obedience to God's law, them living as the people of God, is going to be founded on the grace of what he has already done for them in saving them. And therefore, their obedience to the law that he is about to give to them is not going to be some form of sterile legalism. It's not going to be a blind adherence to a divine set of rules. It is simply going to be the natural response to a gracious deliverance that he has provided to them. Does that sound familiar to our story? For the nation of Israel, who was camped out at Sinai, they're remembering what God did to save them in Egypt. And for us, we look back to something as well, don't we? We look back to what God accomplished for us at the cross. And therefore, everything that we do as the people of God must come in response to our understanding and our appreciation of what God has demonstrated to us in love and grace in the past. Some erroneously believe that the people of the Old Testament and the New Testament were saved in different ways. That the people of the Old Testament were saved by keeping the law. The people in the New Testament saved by grace. The reality is that every person who has ever lived and ever sinned, if they're saved by grace. Not grace alone, but they're saved by grace. In fact, look at chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Notice how the Ten Commandments start. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he starts in. In other words, before he ever gives them the Ten Commandments that we think of as law, he reminds them of what he did for them. He reminds them of his demonstrations of grace. And so whatever God calls us to do in terms of purpose, it must always be set within a context of what God has graciously done for us already in the past. Romans chapter 5, verse 6, verse 8, while we were still helpless, Christ died for the ungodly. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. 1 John 4, verse 10, in this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be a propitiation for our sins. And therefore, any response of love to God on our part must come in response to God's love for us that's been demonstrated in the past, what he's accomplished for us. For Israel, it was them remembering what he had done to the nation of Egypt and how he had delivered them from slavery and bondage. That was what was to motivate them to obey and to keep his covenant with them. Chapter 19 and verse 5. For us, we look back at the cross, and we see that demonstration of love and grace that motivates us to obey and to keep the covenant. But notice in verse 5, I've fallen behind here, aren't I? In verse 5, here is the future of God's purpose. You'll notice in verse 5, he says, chapter 19, and verse 5, now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. Notice that there is a shift from past tense in verse 4 to future in verse 5. His great act of deliverance has already been done, but now God says, look, I have a purpose for you moving forward. I don't know if you've ever been to a mountaintop. I know Lubbock is kind of like where I live. There ain't a lot of mountains around. But maybe you've traveled somewhere else. And if you've ever been to a mountaintop, then it's not going to take a lot of imagination to understand this next illustration. Think about where God is in the story. God is at the top of Mount Sinai. Now, I understand God's omnipresent. He's not located there. He dwells in a higher than just a single mountain. But in the story, in the narrative, God is at the top of the mountain with Moses, and Israel is at the foot of the mountain. And when you are at the foot of the mountain, your vision is extremely limited. From Israel's vantage point, at the foot of the mountain, they are the only people that are around. They are the only ones that God has rescued. They're the only ones that God has demonstrated his concern for. And God, to some extent, acknowledges that, right? He says, you are my special people with whom I have a covenant. In fact, you'll notice in verse 5, he calls them my own possession. The version that Caleb read, my treasured possession, I think is the version that he read there. It's an interesting Hebrew word. It's a word that spoke of that was sometimes used to describe royal property. We understand that in an absolute monarchy, that the king owns everything and the citizens own nothing. But out of that sort of big circle of total ownership, a king might decide he likes this particular thing or this particular thing over here. It's especially prized by him, and he makes that his own in a unique sense. Not just as in terms of an absolute monarchy, it belongs to me, but this is my unique possession. This is my own personal choice, and I'm going to set it over here with my stuff and count it as mine. That's the word that God uses here to describe Israel. That in the big ownership of things, you are my special possession as a result of my personal choice. And while Israel was in Egypt, God had implemented that choice. They would be the jewel of his crown. But Israel at the foot of the mountain is not to make the mistake that they're the only people on earth, that they're the only ones that God is concerned about. While at the foot of the mountain, they might begin to think, hey, we're the only ones God cares for. But notice in verse 5, at the top of the mountain, God says, you're my possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. Israel is not going to be separate from the world just so they can belong to God in some private sense. They're going to belong to God so that they can be used by him for a special purpose. And it's here at Mount Sinai that God's plan for the redemption of man really begins in earnest. And yet in the text, there is one specific thing that's happening, that it's happening with a single nation of people and at one particular place, Mount Sinai. And yet in verse 5, there is also this universal perspective. It's among all of the peoples, and all of the earth is mine. God had rescued one nation from slavery and bondage, but his purpose for that nation in the overall story is for that nation and that event, their deliverance from Egypt, to work to provide release from bondage and slavery to every nation on the planet. Hold your finger here. Look back at Exodus chapter 9. Exodus chapter 9. I want you to notice one thing that the Lord says to Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 9 and verse 16. In Exodus chapter 9 and verse 16, this is, of course, God speaking through Moses, but indeed for this reason, I have allowed you to remain in order to show you my power and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. Pharaoh, I've let you exist. I've let you continue. I could have wiped you out at the first moment that you said, who's the Lord that I should serve him? But instead, I've allowed you to remain because I want to show you my power, but I also want to proclaim my name throughout all of the earth. You remember the story of Rahab? It happens 40 years after Exodus chapter 9. And Rahab is familiar with the Exodus. Over here in the city of Jericho, before internet, before telephones, they've already heard the story. And in Jericho, they are quaking in their boots because of this God who's delivered them from Egypt. Even more amazing, you fast forward a few hundred years, you get over into 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 8. And the Philistines, while they're doing battle with the Israelites, and eventually you remember they'll capture the ark, they point back to the Exodus. Hundreds of years earlier, God had indeed proclaimed his name to all the earth, so that even the nations around Israel are familiar with their God and his deliverance of them from Egypt. And so even though he's only interacting with a single group of people, his purpose for them, his agenda for them is much larger than this local context here in Exodus chapter 19 at Mount Sinai. These are the people that he desires to use in order to bring about blessing and salvation to a host of other people, not just those in Israel. Now, it's true that when you read through the Old Testament, most of the camera frame is filled with Israel. They are uniquely his people. They have been specially chosen for a relationship with him. They are his special focus. But Israel has a purpose. They are to be engaged in something that involves all of the nations. There's something much bigger that they are a part of, and that something bigger is for them as a nation to become a blessing to people of all of the nations of the earth. And yet here in Exodus chapter 19 at Mount Sinai, they're not even aware of that yet. Who are you? What are you doing here? We're the redeemed. We're the delivered. We're the saved. We're the recipients of God's love and mercy. For Israel, it was demonstrated in their exodus from bondage in Egypt. For us, it's our release from bondage to sin at the cross of Jesus Christ. And God is pointing to us, and he is saying to us, you have seen all that I have done for you. You've looked and you've witnessed and experienced everything that I've done to bring you into a unique relationship with myself. But understand that I've done that for a purpose, a reason. And that reason involves not just you. It involves other people. God hasn't demonstrated his grace toward us. He hasn't saved us so we get to be the only folks going to heaven. It's so that we can help other people join that group of folks so they can go to heaven too. That, folks, we have an eternal purpose. That as we live our lives every single day, as we flesh out our relationship with Jesus Christ, our purpose is much bigger than ourselves. And that gives us meaning and significance. And if you're an older person, understand that you may now have more time than you had before to be that kind of person. He ends up with the present grace of God in verse 6. He says, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. We've seen who Israel was. We've seen what they were doing here. Verse 6 tells us who they were supposed to be. And you'll notice that they are identified not as a kingdom of citizens, but rather they are a kingdom of priests. You realize how significant that is? The priesthood of Levi hasn't even been established in the nation of Israel yet. It won't be established for a few more chapters in Exodus. But here God is speaking to the manner in which he intends to use Israel in regard to the other nations. You are going to be my priests. A priest was, in essence, a middleman. He stood between God and man, and he functioned in both directions. So in Israel, ultimately, a priest, on one hand, his job was to teach people the law of God. He was to communicate who God was as a person, his character, his nature. He was to make God known to the people of Israel. That was the role of the priest, and sadly, in Israel, many of those priests failed miserably in that task. But from the other direction, they were also charged with bringing the sacrifices of the people to God that would reconnect the people and their God. And so whether because of some sin or some uncleanness they were prohibited from coming into the presence of God in the assembly of his people, you would bring an animal to the priest. The throat would be cut. Its blood would be offered. When the blood was offered in keeping with the law, the priest would declare that your sin had been atoned for or that your uncleanness had been cleansed. And now you are allowed once again to come back into the presence of God in the assembly and in fellowship with him and with God's people. Israel is commissioned as a kingdom of priests. And by the way, that's the only time this phrase is used in all of the Old Testament. God says to the nation of Israel as a whole, you will be for me what your priests are for you. But you're going to do it for the rest of the nations. You are going to be the people through whom I am going to reveal myself to them. And folks, that's the same role that he's charged us with. That we are to be priests. That we are to be the vehicle by which a knowledge of God is brought to other people, and other people are brought to God. We are his representatives. Hold your place here in Exodus. Look over at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, look at verse 9. What he calls us. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. By the way, that's a quotation from Exodus 19 and verse 6. How is Israel going to accomplish that? Back in chapter 6, it's by being a holy nation. Israel is just one nation among all of the nations of the earth, but as God's own possession, they have been set apart, distinct from all of the other nations, but not distinct in terms of living isolated and distant from everyone else, but rather they were intended to influence the nations around them. That they have been commissioned as a kingdom of priests to share God's person and God's truth, to bring those other nations to a knowledge of God. And they would do that by displaying his nature and by living in the likeness of their Savior. That's how they would show God to the nations around them. Go back to Exodus again. Look at chapter 20 and verse 4. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4, here's the giving of the commandments. And notice that the second commandment is this: you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the water under the earth. Have you thought about why Israel was not to have any kind of images at all? And not just in terms of, well, this piece of stone doesn't fully represent God, or this chunk of wood doesn't fully represent God. They weren't supposed to have an image because they were supposed to be the image. When other nations looked at them, what they were supposed to see was God. To see it in how they lived, to see it in how they treated other people and themselves, how they behaved, how they conducted themselves. You remember back in Genesis chapter 1, we were all made in the image of God. And there's a lot of components to that. We, of course, have distorted that with our own sin. But ultimately, our task today is the same as Israel's. That when people look at us, they see Jesus. Romans 8 and verse 29. We become the image. That when people look at us, they see reflected in our lives the God that we serve. Tragically, Israel failed to live up to that high calling. They disobeyed God's will for them. Rather than bringing glory to their Savior, they instead brought reproach upon him. They became an object of ridicule among the nations. Because they didn't live distinctively. They simply lived like all of the nations around them. And thus the nations were less attracted to Israel's God than they would have otherwise been. That's sort of the first half prior to the captivity. It seems like they learned some things when they came out of the captivity, but now they're coming out of the captivity and they are not so much trying to live like all of the nations, but now they're living hands off. They don't want to have anything to do with the nations. And that wasn't God's purpose for them either. Understand that Israel's disobedience to the covenant requirements had implications that went far beyond their own personal relationship with God. That because they didn't live the way that they should, they hindered other people from coming to know the way that they should live and how they could have a relationship with God. They didn't just affect themselves. They affected a multitude of other people that their lives touched. And it makes you question, doesn't it? Am I living in such a way so that the people that have contact and interaction with me are drawn to him? Or do they not even know that I serve him? It will be by their obedience to God's voice, verse 5, that they will become a different kind of people because they serve a different kind of God. And if we're going to be the people of this kind of God, it demands that we live in a certain way. And God says, when you live in this way, then you can be something for me. Then you can fulfill your purpose that I've given you. Look at Matthew chapter 5. We'll close with this. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13, here near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus addresses this aspect of things, what we are called to be as New Testament Christians. Verse 13, Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. It's not just our belief system. It's our behavior. And our behavior may not be the most important thing, but it certainly is the most visible thing, isn't it? To distinguish us from others who have not been raised up to new life in Christ. What we are required to be as the redeemed people of God is to live according to a high moral standard of thought and action that shows and demonstrates to the world this is how a life is to be lived as the people of God. That's what Paul will later describe in Ephesians 4 and verse 1 as living in a manner that's worthy of our calling. That's what we have been called to do and to be. That the clearest proof of the existence of God to most people is not found in some logical, scintillating argument, not in some powerful rhetoric. It's found in a pure, humble, godly life that's lived in the shadow of the cross and in the brilliance of Christ's resurrection. And it doesn't matter what age you are. You can do that. So that when atheists put a placard on the side of a bus and they proclaim that there's probably no God, that it brings the response from people, I'm not sure that's true. Because there's this fellow at work. There's this young lady that I go to school with. And they're a Christian. And God is obviously real in their lives. They are the living proof of the existence of a living God. Who are you? What are you doing here? Like Israel, we are those who have experienced the grace of God, what he has done in the past in order to redeem us. And understand, he has done everything possible on his side of things. There's nothing that we could do to add to it, nothing we could do to improve upon it. He simply asks that we surrender our will to him. Like Israel, we have been redeemed, and we have been redeemed to fulfill an eternal purpose. And that is not just for us to get to go to heaven, but for others to come to know him as well, and to know the joy that comes from a relationship with God and his Son. And like Israel, we've been called to live in the present in response to his grace, to live differently in every facet of our lives so that others can look at us and they can see him, how he's changed us, how he's molded and shaped us, so that the world will see that there is a living God and that they will come to know him. You want to talk about purpose? You want to talk about meaning? You want to talk about significance in life? We're talking about eternal things. We're not talking about stuff that goes away when you draw our last breath or when the world comes to an end. We're talking about something that exists beyond that. Folks, that's powerful, isn't it? This evening, as we come to a close, have you started on that journey? Have you responded to the wonderful things that God has done to redeem you? That he has sent his son. He sent the very best that heaven had to offer. And Paul makes the point, if he sent, I'm paraphrasing here in Romans 8, if God sent the very best that heaven had to offer, what good thing would he ever withhold from us? He's already given us the very best. But if you've not taken the opportunity, the advantage of what God offers to you, why not tonight? Don't put it off for another moment. Look back at what Christ has done in the past. Look at the purpose that he has for you in the future. Understand how he desires you to live in the present. And begin your relationship with him tonight. If you need to obey the gospel, come right now. Together we stand and sing.